right, so continuing in talking about what psychology is as a field, one place we have to start is with the history. How did we get here of even having a scientific field called psychology? And one thing that you may have noticed or be familiar with is that a lot of the topics and concepts that are included in a psychology textbook, a lot of them could be of interest to people in philosophy. Philosophy is not a science. It's an academic discipline that doesn't pretend to be a science. It's a different sort of field of inquiry. And in philosophy, there are a lot of thought exercises, but not the requirement that you do that you gather evidence, that you do experimentation, that you conduct studies. But a lot of what we now recognize as psychology, or the realm of the topics that would be covered in psychology, they started off as topics that were covered in philosophy. So psychology very much has its roots in ancient philosophy. And we can go all the way back to Socrates and Plato. I'm hoping you've at least heard those names before. Sometimes I get students who will just kind of look around and say, I know, can you remind me? Who were those guys? I know they're important, right? Because, hey, not everybody retains the same information. Not everybody's interested in the same things that they learn in high school or in previous college coursework. So Socrates, and since I am Generation X and saw the movie Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure 3 times in the theater when it first came out when I was in 8th grade, I always have to say Socrates. If you don't, it's from the movie. The running joke was they couldn't pronounce his name. All right, Gen X gets it. Since most of my students are not, they're like, we don't get it. That's okay. That will happen a lot, by the way. For those of you who are taking the class with me, some of the jokes may fall flat. It's okay. So Socrates, and you may be familiar that Plato was a student of Socrates, and then later Aristotle was a student of Plato. So a lot of these famous guys, they were in the same circles, but they were in ancient Greece. All right, so Socrates and Plato, they did many things, but one of the things that's particularly important to psychology and the overall field and the development of a field of psychology is that they talked about this concept that we label as dualism. Dualism, dual means two. It has to do with two of something, or a split or a separation in some way, and it has to do with the split between the mind and the body. All right, so Socrates and Plato believed that the mind did not cease to exist when the body died, that thoughts and ideas could exist separately from the body. All right, so this idea we label as dualism. And in philosophy, there were other figures who kind of took on the challenge of navigating, whether we did have dualism or how the mind and the body were related. What is the relation, or what's the degree of separation between the mind and the body? Now, importantly, a lot of the early roots of psychology, we can put that under a general category called pre-scientific psychology. This is when these topics were not subjected to the scientific method. They weren't subjected to experimentation and evidence gathering. But the scientific revolution, now you may know that term from history classes, it's okay if you don't, but there was this scientific revolution where in other sciences, those sciences that we think of when we think of the word science, in areas like chemistry and physics and biology, a lot of major advances happened. And we're talking, well, I'm going to focus on late 1500s into the 1600s. One particularly important thing that happened, it wasn't with the scientists, but it happened during the scientific revolution, so there was some influence there. Another philosopher, French philosopher, Renee Descartes. Now, since the spelling of the name, sometimes people will struggle with pronunciation and say, Descartes or something like that. But my understanding is it is Descartes. And obviously I'm not French. I'm not going to have perfect pronunciation. And so Descartes, he did, like Socrates' idea of the mind being distinct from the body. And so or indistinct from the body, and he wanted to see how the mind and body were connected. Unlike other philosophers, he actually overlapped with science, in particular with biology and anatomy. He actually performed dissections looking at brains, because by this point we had figured out that the brain was important for functions that we would consider mind functions, for mental processes. There was a time, like the ancient Egyptians thought that the heart was where that was located. And the other ideas have been presented, but by this point we had figured out, hey, the brain is important. So sometimes instead of mind, people will say brain, but before this we were saying, hey, mind, the thought stuff. And so he dissected these brains in humans and in animals, and he was very interested in the fact that the brain had two sides, two hemispheres. It had symmetry. But there was this interesting part that did not have two sides, and that is the pineal gland. Okay, now one thing Descartes didn't know is the pineal gland is actually separate from the brain. It's just attached. He did not know that. He thought it was a part of the brain, and it kind of hangs in the middle, and it's just one thing. It's not you don't have a right and a left pineal gland. You just have one, and it's kind of right in the center. So he wondered if that meant that the pineal gland was special in some way, maybe even the seat of the soul, or the seat of something important like the stuff that we get with our mind processes. And so he proposed a lot of stuff that we now know is incorrect, because we can verify things or refute ideas through experimentation, through observation, through more advanced research methods. But this idea got people talking, got people thinking about how things work, how the mind and the body are related. He also planted the seeds for our idea of nerves. If you know nerves, some of you might have just heard the term nerves when someone just says, "Oh, you're getting on my nerves. Oh, I've got bad nerves." Which often meaning I feel anxious today. Well, nerves are also, in your body important for communication with the brain and other parts of the body. And so, he proposed a lot of ideas that got people thinking and wondering, and leading to other advances that helped us understand that ultimately how our brain works and how we have mental processes versus what's happening in our body, in our physical body. All right, now some other important names. We're still under the general category of pre-scientific psychology, even though scientific revolution going on, but psychology has still not been turned into an official science. And so we had Descartes, who had been inspired by Socrates and Plato. We have this other big name who is kind of not quite opposite, but did not agree with Descartes, and that is John Locke. If you ever were a fan of the TV show Lost, you may know there was a character named John Locke. So I think of him because I watched that show. And so Locke had this idea that people were born as a blank slate. Specifically, he used the term tabula rasa, which translates roughly to blank slate. The idea that you're born not with any predispositions, any inclinations. Today we might think in terms of genetic influences. The idea you're born a blank slate, and the world, your experiences, influence you to become the person you ultimately become. So he said that people gain knowledge through their experiences. Through things that happen to you, through your observations. And later, that's going to be important for some subfields of psychology that we will talk about. Now, very important, he emphasized that observation was important. This inspired a very important concept called empiricism. Empiricism has to do with gathering evidence. Empirical evidence is evidence that you gathered through your five senses in some way. You actually witnessed something, heard something. You don't just trust that something is true. You actually observed evidence that it is true, that is what happens. And so careful external and internal observation. Right? So we get this idea of empiricism, which is critical to the scientific method. So the next step is going to be talking about the scientific method and how we ended up with an officially, truly scientific field of psychology.